Well, good evening. Welcome. How many of you, is this your very first time to an Evening of Hope event or to a tour of hope? This is your very first time to an Evening of Hope or tour of hope. Would you raise your hand? Wow, that's a lot. Well, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. As many of you may know, I'm a big fan of C.S. Lewis. And during the last month, I've been rereading one of his classic books called The Four Loves. And as I thought about sharing the Hope Academy story tonight, I've been struck by how two of the four loves, agape or gift love, and philia or friendship love, were both at the heart of the founding of Hope Academy. I still remember 17 years ago, suffering through the most difficult night of my life as I contemplated venturing something crazy for God, and as I wrestled with submitting to God's call to start Hope Academy. But before I tell you about that terrible night, let me back up 8 years before that and give you some of the backstory. In 1991, my wife Phyllis and I were looking to buy our first home in Minneapolis. And we asked ourselves a question that few others were asking themselves. The question was this: if followers of Jesus were called to be the light of the world, what part of our city was most in need of the light of the gospel? Maybe we should move there. Well, everyone in Minneapolis knows there's one neighborhood almost nobody wanted to live in. It's called the Phillips neighborhood, and you're in it right now. And for decades, it's been known primarily for two things: extreme poverty and violent crime. Home to 17,000 residents, most people in the Phillips neighborhood don't own their homes. They rent them. 80% of the residents rent from month to month, and they move several times a year. 50% of us in the neighborhood live below the federal poverty level. And in 1996, when over 40 homicides occurred in our neighborhood, state troopers were sent into the area to patrol our streets. Each Monday morning, I receive an email from Inspector Johnson, commander of the 3rd Precinct, outlining the criminal enforcement activities that have occurred during the previous week within a 4-block area around Hope Academy. Last week, there were 20 drug arrests, 25 arrests for prostitution, and 3 robbery suspects were arrested. On top of this, Phillips has the highest concentration of registered sex offenders living in it of any neighborhood in the state. And in the last month, there were 3 homicides within a 4-block area here of the school. When my father heard that we were buying a house in Phillips, he said, "Russ, you're an idiot." He said, "Everybody knows that you buy a house as an investment. You know, your investment is going to decrease in value every year. You're going to be paying an annual tax for the privilege of living in Phillips." But against his advice, 25 years ago, we bought our home 3 blocks from here. Still live in it today. And as our children became school age, my wife and I began to understand that the poverty and crime in our neighborhood had a deeper root. There was an education crisis in my neighborhood of which I was completely ignorant. Soon I learned that over 50% of my neighbors were failing to graduate from high school. And those that did graduate would on average only be able to read at an 8th grade level. I learned that our state, Minnesota, had the largest achievement gap between whites and students of color of any state in the country. and that my neighbors of color were getting one of the worst educations in the whole country. And I discovered that nearly every child who's not reading by third grade is likely to spend some time in his or her life in prison. In 2010, when filmmakers made a documentary about this education crisis, do you know what they called it? Waiting for Superman. You know, like all parents, my wife and I wanted a great education for our own kids. And so, what did we do when they became school age? We drove our kids 10 miles across town to attend a great Christian school in the wealthiest neighborhood of our city. And this solution created a gigantic problem for us. We had moved into Phillips to be a light to our neighbors, and we were now forced to ask ourselves another important question. What does it mean to really love your neighbor as yourself? Wanting to justify myself, like the story of the Good Samaritan, I asked myself the question, well, who is my neighbor? Let me tell you about what life is like for Jasmine, a teenage girl living on my block. Jasmine typically misses 1 or 2 days of school each week. And when she comes to school, she's often exhausted. She doesn't sleep well because there's so many gunshots fired around her apartment. She and her mom and her 2 younger brothers will probably move to another apartment next month. And the few things that Jasmine has are still in boxes from last month's move. Her dad is in prison, and her mom works 2 part-time jobs. Because her mom sleeps in the morning, Jasmine has to get her brothers up herself and get them ready for school. There's usually no food in the refrigerator or the cupboards, but she gets breakfast at school. Jasmine's not on track to graduate. She doesn't understand what's going on in math class. She hasn't for years. And she doesn't do the homework anymore because nobody seems to really care anyway. Jasmine wants to play on the basketball team, but her mom said she can't because she has to take care of her brothers after school. However, she can't risk taking them to the park to play because it's not safe. She's never been on a family vacation, never even visited suburbs like Woodbury or Eden Prairie, although she's heard of them and wonders what they're like. If she's like most of her friends, Jasmine will probably have a child and drop out of her school. Jasmine is my neighbor. So what could it mean to love Jasmine as myself? Every month, a different church or ministry group comes to the park right next door here, PV Park, and cooks up a meal to serve the poor. I bet you can guess what's always on the menu. It's always hot dogs. And if I were going to serve my neighbors with an education, I would be tempted to serve them a hot dog education, even though none of us wants that kind of school for our own kids. And if I want a filet mignon education for my own kids, shouldn't I want that same kind of education for my neighbors? And of course, that kind of love would be so costly. C.S. Lewis recognized that loving our neighbor always costs something. Always. In his book, The Four Loves, Lewis said, "We shall draw nearer to God, not by trying to avoid the sufferings inherent in all loves, but by accepting them and offering them to God. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be crushed and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries, Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in the casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, your heart will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. Which brings me back to that terrible sleepless night 17 years ago. I knew that starting Hope Academy would completely upset my life. I would need to quit my job. I had a great job that I loved. I had a wife and 3 young children to support. What was I thinking? I wasn't even qualified to lead my block club, much less lead a school. I didn't even have a teacher's license. I didn't have a school building. I didn't have any teachers. What was I thinking? And on top of all that, quitting my job to start a school would look so foolish to all my friends and family. I was an elder at my church. Elders don't do reckless things. Was I willing to be a fool for Christ? I knew that if I quit my job to start Hope, there was no going back. I remember praying that night, Father, if there's any other way to love my neighbors without quitting my job, please show me how. Could I agape love my neighbor without the sacrifice? And that's where the second kind of love comes into the story. Friendship love. You see, by God's grace, when I didn't think I could take that step of faith, God gave me a special friendship. Just a couple weeks before that terrible night of wrestling, God introduced me to a new friend, Jeff Bird. Lewis says that friendship arises out of mere companionship when 2 or more of the companions discover that they have in common some insight or interest or even taste which others do not share, and which till that moment each believed to be his own unique treasure or burden. The typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." And 4 weeks earlier, during my first meeting with Jeff, completely out of the blue, he asked, "Do you know anything about Christian schools in the inner city?" I thought I'd misheard him, so I asked him to repeat himself. He said that he had a growing sense that God had wanted him to start a school for inner city kids. You know, in friendship, the words, "Do you love me?" mean, do you see the same truth? We picture lovers face to face, but friends side by side, their eyes looking ahead. Friendship must always be about something. So what same truth did Jeff and I see that became the foundation for our friendship? What was it that we were amazed to discover that God had given separately to each of us? Well, first, we both believed that the miseducation of inner city youth was one of the most important social justice issues of our day. Second, we both believed that one of the best strategies to redeem and transform the inner city was a great school. And third, we believed that that school would have to be a remarkable school, not just an average one. It would have to be the kind of school that we would want our own children to attend. Fourth, we believed that mankind's chief problem is sin, and that Christ is a great Savior from sin. And so the school would need to be based on the gospel and on the teachings of Christ. Fifth, we believed that parents couldn't and shouldn't be ignored, but they had to be deeply involved in the solution, and they had to have some skin in the game. Sixth, we both believed it was essential to do the really hard work of holding teachers and parents and students accountable for their responsibilities. Seventh, we both believed that results really do matter and that we had to actually close the achievement gap. And finally, we believed that others living outside the neighborhood would rejoice to partner with inner city children to make this kind of school affordable for everyone. What a friend. What a friend. And so by God's grace, with newfound courage, I woke up the next morning, and with great fear and trembling, I walked into my boss's office the next day, and I told him I was quitting my job in order to start a school for my neighbors with my new friend. Little did we know how God would use our little steps of faith to build a great Christ-centered school for urban youth. A school today serving 475 students from 290 families. And day after day, I'm seeing the same group of high poverty, at-risk students beat all the odds and become successful beyond my wildest dreams. Reading the great books, studying Latin and calculus, getting into great colleges, and coming back to the neighborhood to serve our community. Praise God. Tonight you're going to hear a wonderful story about God's redemptive work in the life of one of our seniors, Tion Elder, as told by one of his teachers, Ben Johnson, and by his mother, Marcia Elder. We'll also hear a story of God's redemptive work in Latoya Shower's family. In conclusion, C.S. Lewis says that unlike romantic love, which is ruined by sharing it with others, true friendship is enhanced by expanding the circle. As the Lord provides, our 5-year plan to grow hope is a plan to grow the student body here by 60% and serve 275 more inner city youth with this remarkable education. And of course, each new student will need a partner in order to come. And maybe you see the same truth that Jeff and I did. And if so, we invite you to join with hundreds of us in this room as friends and help us change the world. Agape love and friendship love. It changed my heart, and it will change our city and the world. Thanks for listening.